Good evening. Thank you for joining us again for the Stave 3 of Charles Dickens' Christmas classic, A Christmas Carol. Picking up where we left off last night. Stave 3, the second of three spirits. Awaking in the middle of a prodigiously tough snore and sitting up in bed to get his thoughts together, Scrooge had no occasion to be told that the bell was again upon the stroke of 1. He felt that he was restored to consciousness in the right nick of time, for the special purpose of holding conference with the second messenger dispatched to him through Jacob Marley's intervention. But, finding that he turned uncomfortably cold when he began to wonder which of his curtains this new spectre would draw back, he put them all aside with his own hands, and laying down again established a sharp lookout round the bed. For he wished to challenge the spirit upon its appearance, and did not wish to be taken by surprise and made nervous. Gentlemen of the free and easy sort, who plume themselves on being acquainted with a move or two, and being usually equal to the time of day, express the wide range of their capacity for adventure by observing that they are good from anything from pitch and toss to manslaughter. And anywhere between those opposite extremes, no doubt there lies a tolerably wide and comprehensive range of subjects. Without venturing for Scrooge quite as heartily as this, I don't mind calling on you to believe that he was ready for a good field of strange appearances, and that nothing between a baby and a rhinoceros would have surprised him much. Now, being prepared for almost anything, he was not by any means prepared for nothing. And consequently, when the bell struck 1, and no shape appeared, he was taken with a fit of violent trembling. 5 minutes. 10. A quarter past the hour, and nothing came. All this time, he lay upon his bed, the very core and center of a blaze of ruddy light, which streamed upon him when the clock proclaimed the hour, and by which only being light was more alarming than a dozen ghosts, as he was powerless to make out what it meant, or what it would be at, and was sometimes apprehensive that he might be, at the very moment, an interesting case of spontaneous combustion without having the consolation of knowing it. At last, however, he began to think, as you or I might have done from the start, for it is always the person not in the predicament who knows what ought to have been done, and would unquestionably have done it as well. At last, I say, he began to think that the source and secret of this ghostly light might have been adjoining from the room next door, and whence on further tracing it, it seemed to shine. Pardon me. This idea taking full possession of his mind, he got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. The moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock, a strange voice called him by name and bade him enter. He obeyed. It was his own room. There was no doubt whatsoever about that. But it had gone the most surprising transformation. The walls and ceiling were so hung with living green that it looked a perfect grove, from every part of which bright beaming berries glistened. Pardon me, my nose is quite itchy tonight, I apologize. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light as if so many little mirrors had been scattered there, and such a mighty blaze went roaring up in the chimney as that dull petrification of a hearth had never known in Scrooge's time, nor Marley's, nor in many, many a winter season gone past. Heaped up upon the floor to form kind of a throne were turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, great joints of meat, suckling pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense 12 cakes, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. In an easy state upon his couch there was a jolly giant, glorious to behold, who bore a glowing torch in a shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and held it up high, high, to shed its light upon Scrooge as he came peeping round the door. "Come in!" exclaimed the ghost. "Come in and know me a better man." Scrooge entered mildly and hung his head before the spirit. He was not the dogged Scrooge he had been, and though the spirit's eyes were clear and kind, he did not want to meet them. I am the ghost of Christmas present. Look upon me, said the spirit. Scrooge reverently did so. It was clothed in one simple deep green robe or mantle bordered with white fur. This garment hung so loosely on the figure that its capacious breast was bare, as if disdaining to be warded or concealed by any artifice. Its feet, observable beneath the ample folds of this garment, were also bare, and on its head wore no other covering than a wreath of holly, set here and there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free as its genial face, its sparkling eye, its open hand, and its cheery voice and demeanor. Girded around the middle, there was an antique scabbard, but with no sword inside, and the ancient sheath was eaten with rust. "You've never seen the likes of me before, eh?" exclaimed the spirit. No, never. Have never walked forth with any of the younger members of my family, meaning, for I am very young, my elder brothers born these later years? Pursued the phantom. I don't think so. I'm afraid not. Have you many brothers, spirit? More than 1,800! A tremendous family to provide for, followed Scrooge. The ghost of Christmas present rose. Spirit, Scrooge said submissively, conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion. I have learnt a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you had aught to teach me, let me profit by it. Take hold of my robe, man. Scrooge did as he was told and held it fast. Holly, mistletoe, red berry, ivies, turkey, geese, game, poultry, brawn, meat, pigs, sausages, oysters, pies, puddings, fruit, and punch all vanished instantly. So did the fire, and the room, and the ruddy glow, and the hour of night, and they stood in a street, on a city, on Christmas morn, where, for the weather was severe, the people made a rough but brisk and not unpleasant kind of music, in scraping the snow from the pavement in front of their dwellings and from the rooftops of their houses, whence it was made mad delight to the boys to see it come plumbing down to the road and splitting into artificial snowstorms. The house fronts looked black enough, and the windows blacker still, contrasting the smooth white sheet of snow upon the roofs with the dirtier snow upon the ground, which last deposit had been plowed into deep furrows by heavy wheels of carts and wagons, furrows that crossed and recrossed each other hundreds of times, where the streets branched off and made intricate channels hard to trace in the thick yellow mud and icy snow. The sky was gloomy, and the shortest streets were choked up with a dingy mist, half thawed, half frozen, whose heavier particles descended in a shower of sooty atoms, as if by one consent all the chimneys in Britain had caught fire and were blazing away to their dear heart's content. There was nothing very cheerful about the broadness, and about the clear... my mistake. There was nothing very cheerful in the climate or the town, and yet there was an air of cheerfulness abroad, that the clearest summer air and brightest summer sun might have endeavored to diffuse in vain. For the people who were shoveling away on the housetops were jovial and full of glee, calling out to one another from the parapets, and now and then exchanging a facetious snowball, better-natured missile by far than a wordy jest, laughing heartily if it went right, and not less heartily if it went wrong. The poulterers' shops were still half opened, and the fruitiers were radiant in their glory. There were great round pot-bellied baskets of chestnuts, shaped like the waistcoats of jolly old gentlemen, lolling at the doors and tumbling out into the streets with their apoplectic opulence. There were ruddy, brown-faced, broad-girthed Spanish onions, shining in their fatness like growth of Spanish friars, and winking from their shelves on wanton slyness at the girls who went by, and glanced demurely at the hung-up mistletoe. There were pears and apples, clustered high in blooming pyramids, where there were bunches of grapes made by shopkeepers' benevolence to dangle from conspicuous hooks that people's mouths might water gratis when they passed. There were piles of filberts, mossy and brown, recalling in their fragrance ancient walks among the woods, and pleasant shufflings ankle-deep through withered leaves. There were Norfolk biffins, squab and swarthy, setting off the yellow of the oranges and lemons, and in great compactness of their juicy Persians, urgently entreating and beseeching to be carried home in a paper bag and eaten after supper. The very gold and silver fish, set forth among these choice fruits in a bowl, though members of a dull and stagnant-blooded race appeared to know that there was something going on, and to a fish went gasping around and round in their little world, slow, passionless excitement. The grocers, oh, the grocers, nearly closed with perhaps 2 shutters down, or 1, but through those gaps such glimpses. It was not alone that the scales descending on the counter made a merry sound, or that the twine and roller parted company so briskly, or that the canisters were rattled up and down like juggling tricks, or even that blended scents of tea and coffee were so grateful to the nose, or even that the raisins were so plentiful and rare, the almonds so extremely white, the sticks of cinnamon so long and straight, and other spices so delicious, the candied fruits so caked and spotted with molten sugar as to make the coldest lookers-on feel faint and subsequently bilious. Nor was it that the figs were moist and pulpy, or the French plums blushed in modest tartness from their high decorated boxes, or that everything was good to eat in its Christmas dress, but the customers were all so hurried and so eager in the hopeful promise of the day that they tumbled up against each other and up against the door, clashing their wicker baskets wildly, and left their purchases upon the counter and came running back to fetch them, and committed hundreds of the like offenses in the best humor possible, while the grocers and people were so frank and fresh that the polished hearts with which they fastened their aprons might have been their own, worn on the outside for general inspection and for Christmas daws to peck at should they choose. But soon the steeples called all people good and evil to church and chapel, and away they came, flocking through the streets in their best clothes, with their gayest faces, and at the same time they were emerged from scores of by-streets, lanes, and nameless turnings, innumerable people carrying their dinners to the bake shops. The sight of these poor revelers appeared to interest the spirit very much, for he stood, with Scrooge beside him, in a baker's doorway, and taking off the covers as their bearers passed, sprinkled incense on their dinners from his torch, and it was a very uncommon kind of torch. For once or twice, when there were angry words between some dinner carriers who had jostled each other, he shed a few drops of water on it from them, and their good humor was restored directly. For they said it was a shame to quarrel upon Christmas, and so it was. God bless it, so it was. In times the bells ceased, and the bakers were shut up, and yet there was a genial shadowing forth of all these dinners, and the progress of their cooking in the thawed blotch of wet above each baker's oven, where the pavement stones smoked as if they were cooking too. "Is there a peculiar flavor which you sprinkle from your torch?" asked Scrooge. "There is. My own." "Would it apply to any kind of dinner on this day?" asked Scrooge. "To any kindly given. To a poor one most." "Why to a poor one most?" followed Scrooge. "Because it needs it most." "Spirit," said Scrooge, after a moment's thought, "I wonder you, of all beings in the many worlds about us, should desire to cramp these people's opportunities of innocent enjoyment." "I?" cried the spirit. "You would deprive them of their means of dining every 7th day, often the only day with which they can be said to dine at all. Wouldn't you?" asked Scrooge. "Aye!" cried the spirit again. You would deprive them of their means of dining every 7th day. Oh. You seek to close these places on the 7th day, and it comes to the same thing." "I seek!" exclaimed the spirit. "Forgive me if I am wrong. It has been done in your name, or at least the name of your family." "There are many upon this earth of yours," returned the spirit, "who lay claim to know us, and do their deeds of passion, pride, ill will, hatred, envy, bigotry, and selfishness in our name, who are as strange to us, and all our kith and kin, had they never lived. Remember that, and charge their doings on themselves, not on us." Scrooge promised that he would, and they went on, invisible as they had been before, into the suburbs of the town. It was a remarkable quality of the ghost, which Scrooge had observed at the baker's, that notwithstanding his gigantic size, he could accommodate himself in any place with ease, and that he stood beneath a low roof quite as gracefully and like the supernatural creature as it was possible that he could have done in any lofty hall. And perhaps it was the pleasure of the spirit had in showing off of his powers, or else it was his own kind, generous, hearty nature, and his sympathy with all poor men that led him straight to Scrooge's clerks. For there he went, and took Scrooge with him, holding on to his robe, and on the threshold of the door the spirit smiled and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with a sprinkling of his torch. Think of that. Bob had but 15 bob a week himself. He pocketed on Saturdays but 15 copies of his Christian name, and yet the ghost of Christmas present blessed his four-roomed home. Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons, which are cheap and make a goodly show for a sixpence. She had laid out the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes, and getting the corners of his monstrous shirt collar, Bob's private property, conferred upon his son and heir, in honor of the day, into his mouth, rejoiced to find himself so gallantly attired, and yearned off to show his linen in the fashionable parks. And now 2 smaller Cratchits, a boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming outside the baker's they had smelt the goose and known it for their own, and basking in the luxurious thoughts of sage and onion. These young Cratchits danced about the table and exalted Master Peter to the skies, while he, not proud, although his collars nearly choked him, blew the fire until the slow potatoes bubbled up, knocked loudly at the lid to be let out and peeled. "Whatever's gotten into your precious father, then?" said Mrs. Cratchit. "And your brother, Tiny Tim? And Martha? She weren't as late last Christmas by half an hour." "Here's Martha, mother!" A girl appeared as she spoke. "Here's Martha, mother!" cried 2 young Cratchits. "Hurrah, Martha! Such a goose!" "Why, bless your heart alive, how late you are, my dear!" said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times and taking off her shawl and bonnet for her, with officious zeal. "We'd a deal of work to finish up last night, and had to clear away this morning, mother." "Oh, well, never you mind, as long as you're come," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Sit ye down by the fire and have a warm, Lord bless you." "No, no, father's coming!" cried the 2 young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. "Hide, Martha, hide!" So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter, exclusive of the fringe, hanging down before him in his threadbare clothes, darned up and brushed to look seasonable, Tiny Tim upon his shoulders. Alas, for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. "Why, where's our Martha?" said Bob, looking around. "Oh, she's not coming." "Not coming?" said Bob, with a sudden declination in his high spirits, for he had been Tim's blood horse all the way from church, and had been running home rampant. "Not coming upon Christmas Day?" Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if it even were only a joke. So she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the 2 young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the wash-house, so that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. "And how did little Tim behave in church?" asked Mrs. Cratchit, when she had rallied Bob on his credulity, and Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. "As good as gold, and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you'd ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he hoped that people saw him in church because he was a cripple, and that it might be pleasant for them to remember upon Christmas Day who it was that made lame beggars walk and blind men see." Bob's voice was a bit tremulous at this, and he trembled even more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing stronger and heartier. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim without another word spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool before the fire. And while Bob, turning up his cuffs, as if, poor fellow, it were possible to be made more shabby, compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and put it before the hob to simmer, Master Peter and the 2 ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they returned soon in high procession. Such a bustle ensued that you might have thought the goose the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon to which a black swan was a matter of course, and in truth it was something very much like that in this house. Miss Cratchit made the gravy, ready beforehand in a little saucepan, and hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor. Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce. Martha dusted the hot plates, and Bob took Tiny Tim beside him by the fire, in the tiny corner of a table. The two young Cratchits set up chairs for everyone, not forgetting themselves, and mounting guard upon their posts, cramming spoons into their mouths, lest they should shriek for goose before their turn came. At last the dishes were set on, and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause, as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly along the edge of the carving knife, prepared to plunge it into the beast. But when she did, the long-expected gush of steam issued forth. One murmur of delight arose among round the table. Even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat upon the table with the handle of his knife and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" There never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there was ever such a goose cooked. Its tenderness, flavor, size, and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by the applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of bone left upon the dish, they hadn't eaten it all at last. Yet everyone had had enough, and the young Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onions to the eyebrows. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda Cratchit, Miss Cratchit left the room alone, too. She was too nervous to bear the witness to the taking up of the pudding and bringing it in. Suppose it should be not done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody should have gotten over the wall of the backyard and stolen it while they were merry with the goose. A supposition at which the two young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horrors were supposed. Hullo! A great deal of steam, and the pudding was out of the copper. A smell like washing day, that was the cloth. A smell like an eating house and a pastry cook's next door to each other, with a laundress's next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly with the pudding, like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in a half of a quartern of ignited brandy and bedight with Christmas holly on top. Oh, a wonderful pudding! Bob Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he regarded it to be the greatest success ever achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that now the weight was off her mind, she would confess she had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought that it was at all a small pudding for such a large family. It would have been flat heresy to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. At last, dinner was all done. The cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect. Apples and oranges were put on the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts cast upon the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth in what Bob called a circle, meaning a half of one, and Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as golden goblets could have, and Bob served it out with beaming looks while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and cracked noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all! God bless us!" Which the whole family re-echoed. "God bless us, everyone," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close at his father's side, upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to be kept by his side always, and that he was dreading that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me, will Tiny Tim live?" "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner, a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." No, Oh no, kind spirit, say he will be spared. If these shadows of the future remain unaltered, none other of my race will find him here. What then? If he be like to die, then he'd better do it, and decrease the surplus population. Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit, and was overcome by penitence and grief. Man, if man you be in heart, and not adamant, forbear that wicked cant until you have discovered what the surplus population is and where it is. Will you decide what men will live and what men will die? It may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. Oh God, to hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on too much life to his hungry brothers in the dust. Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke, and cast his eyes trembling down upon the ground. But he raised them speedily upon hearing his own name. Mr. Scrooge, said Bob, I give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of our feast. The founder of our feast indeed, said Mrs. Cratchit, reddening in the face. I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I'd hope he had a good appetite for it. My dear, the children, Christmas Day. It should be Christmas Day, Bob, I'm sure, on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. God bless you, you'll know it better than anyone. My dear, was Bob's mild answer, Christmas Day. I'll drink for his health. I'll drink for his health for your sake, and the day's, but not for his. Long life to him, and a Merry Christmas to him, and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt. The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings which had no heartiness in it. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care twopence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for a full 5 minutes. But after it had passed, they were 10 times the merrier than before, from mere relief of Scrooge the baleful being done with. Bob Cratchit told them how he had an eye on his situation for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, a full 5 and 6 pence weekly. The two young Cratchits laughed tremendously at hearing the idea of Peter's being a man of business, and young Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire from between his collars, as if he were deliberating what particular investments he should favor when he came into the receipt of that bewildering sum of money. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at a milliner's, then told them what kind of work she had to do, and how many hours she worked at a stretch, and how she meant to have a good long lie in bed tomorrow morning, for a long rest, tomorrow's being a holiday that she passed at home. Also how she had seen a countess and a lord some days before, and how the lord was much about as tall as Peter was, at which Peter pulled up his collar so high that you couldn't have seen his head if you'd been there. All this time the chestnuts in the jug went round and round and by and by. They had a song about a lost child traveling in the snow from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice and sang it very well indeed. There was nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty, and Peter might have known, and likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker's. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time, and when they faded, looked happier yet in the bright sparklings of the spirit's torch. Scrooge had his eye upon them, especially upon Tiny Tim, until the last. By this time it was getting dark, and snowing pretty heavily, and as Scrooge and the spirits went along the streets, the brightness of the roaring fires in the kitchens and parlors and all sorts of rooms was wonderful. Here the flickering blaze showed preparations for a cozy dinner, with hot plates baking through and through before the fire, the deep red curtains ready to be drawn and shut out the cold and the darkness. There, all the children of the house, running out into the snow to meet their married sisters and brothers, cousins and uncles and aunts, and would be the first to greet them. Here again were shadows on the window blind of guests assembling, where groups of handsome girls, all hooded and fur-booted and all chattering at once, tripped off lightly to some near neighbor's house where, woe upon the single man who saw them enter, artful witches, and they knew it, and all aglow. But if you had judged from the number of people on their way to friendly gatherings, you might have thought that no one was going to be at home to give them welcome when they got there, instead of every house expecting company and piling up its fires half chimney high. Blessings on it. Oh, how the spirit exulted. It was bared through its breast and the breadth of his breast, and the opening of his capacious palm, and floated on, outpouring with a generous hand its bright and harmless mirth upon everything within his reach. The very lamplighter who ran on before, dotting the dusky dark with specks of light, and who was dressed to spend Christmas evening somewhere, laughed out loud as the spirit passed, though little kenned the lamplighter that he had any company but Christmas itself. And now, without a word of warning from the ghost, they stood upon a bleak desert moor, where the monstrous masses of rude stone were cast about, as though they were burial places of giants, and the water spread itself whereversoever it wanted. And it would have done so but for the frost that held it prisoner, and nothing grew but moss and furze and coarse, rank grass. Down in the west, the setting sun had left a streak of fiery red, upon which glared the desolation for but an instant, like a sullen eye, and a frowning lower, lower, and lower yet, until it was lost in the thick gloom of darkest night. "What place is this?" inquired Scrooge. "This is a place where miners live, who labor in the bowels of the earth. But they know me. See!" A light shone from the window of a hut, and swiftly they advanced towards it, passing through the wall of mud and stone. They found a cheerful company assembled round a glowing fire, an old man and woman with their children and their children's children, and another generation beyond that, all decked out gaily in their holiday attire. The old man, in a voice that seldom rose above the howling of the wind upon the barren waste, was singing a Christmas song. It had been a very old song when he was a boy, and from time to time they all joined in the chorus. So surely as they raised their voices, the old man got quite blithe and loud, and so surely as they stopped, his vigor sank again. The spirit did not tarry here, but bade Scrooge hold on to his robe, and passing above the moor, sped hither. Not to see. Oh, to see! To Scrooge's horror, looking back, he saw that the last vestiges of land, a frightful range of rocks behind them, and his ears were deafened by the thundering water as it rolled and roared and raged amongst the dreadful caverns it had worn, and fiercely trying to undermine the earth. Built upon a dismal reef of sunken rocks some league or so from shore, on which the waters chafed and dashed the wild year through, there stood a solitary lighthouse. Great heaps of seaweed clung to its base, and storm birds, born of the wind, one might suppose, as seaweed is born of water, rose and fell about it like the waves they skimmed. But even there, two men who watched the light had made a fire, that through the loophole in some thick stone wall shed out a ray of brightness on the awful sea. Joining their horny hands over the rough table which they sat, they wished each other a Merry Christmas in their own can of grog. And one of them, the elder too, with his face all scarred and damaged from hard weather, as if the figurehead of an old ship might be, struck up a sturdy song that was like the gale itself. Again the spirit strode on amongst the black and heaving seas, on and on and on, until being far away, as he told Scrooge, from any shore, they lighted on a ship. They stood beside the helmsman at the wheel, and the lookout on the bow, and the officers who had taken the watch, dark, ghostly figures in their several stations, but every man among them hummed a Christmas tune, or had a Christmas thought, or spoke below his breath to his companion of some bygone Christmas day, with homeward hopes belonging to it. And every man on board, waking or sleeping, good or bad, had a kinder word for another on that day than on any other day of the year, and had shared to some extent in its festivities, and remembered those he cared for at a distance, and had known that they had delighted to remember him too. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while listening to the moaning of the wind and thinking what a solemn thing it was to move through the lonely darkness over an unknown abyss, whose depths were secret and profound as death. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while thus engaged, to hear a hearty laugh. It was much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a dry, bright, gleaming room with the spirit standing smiling by his side, looking at that same nephew with approving affability. Laughed Scrooge's nephew. Oh, my lord! If you should happen by any unlikely chance to know a man more blessed in a laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say is I should like to know him too. Introduce him to me and I shall cultivate his acquaintance. It is a fair, even-handed, noble adjustment of things that while there is an infection in disease and sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humor. When Scrooge's nephew had laughed in this way, holding his sides and rolling his head, twisting his face into the most extravagant extortions, Scrooge's niece by marriage laughed as heartily as he, and their assembled friends, not being a bit behindhand, roared out lustily. He said that. He said that Christmas was a humbug, said Scrooge's nephew, and he believed it too. More shame for him, Fred, said Scrooge's nephew indignantly. Bless those women. They never do anything by halves. They are always in earnest. She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised-looking, capital face and a ripe little mouth that seemed to be made to be kissed, as no doubt it was. All kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in any creature's head. Although she was what you would have called provoking, you know, she was satisfactory. Oh, perfectly satisfactory. He's a comical fellow, said Scrooge's nephew. That's the truth, but not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offenses carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him. I'm sure he's very rich, hinted Scrooge's niece. At least you always tell me so. Well, what of it, my dear? His wealth is of no use to him. He doesn't do himself any good with it. He doesn't make himself comfortable. He hasn't got the satisfaction of thinking that he's ever going to benefit us with it. I have no patience for him, observed Scrooge's niece. Scrooge's niece's sisters and all the other ladies expressed the same opinion. Oh, I have, returned Scrooge's nephew. I'm sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers from his ill whims? Himself, always. Here, he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He doesn't lose much of a dinner. Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner, interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges, because they had just finished dinner, and with the dessert upon the table were clustered all around the fire by lamplight. Oh, well, I'm very glad to hear it, returned Scrooge's nephew, because I haven't got much faith in these young housekeepers. What do you have to say, Topper? Topper had clearly got his eye on one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that he was a bachelor and a wretched outcast who had no right to express an opinion on such a tender subject. Whereat Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one with the lace tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed. Oh, do go on, Fred, said Scrooge's niece, clapping her hands. He never finishes anything he begins to say. He's such a ridiculous fellow. Scrooge's nephew reveled in another laugh, as it was impossible to keep the infection off, though the plump sister tried as hard as she could with aromatic vinegar. This example was unanimously followed. I was going to say, said Scrooge's nephew, that the consequence of him taking a dislike to us and not making merriment with us is that I think he loses some pleasant moments, which could do him no harm. And I am sure he loses pleasanter companions than he could find with his own chambers. Be it in his moldy old office, his dusty old bedchamber, and I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him to. If he finds me going there, in good temper, year after year, saying, Uncle Scrooge, how are you? If it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something. And I think I shook him yesterday. Now it was their turn. The notion of shaking Scrooge, but being thoroughly good-natured and not caring much about what they laughed at, so that they all laughed at any rate, he encouraged them in their merriment and passed the bottle joyously. After tea they had some music, for they were a musical family, and they knew what they were about. When they sung a glee or catch, I can assure you, especially Topper, who could growl away in the bass like a good one, and never swell the large veins in his forehead or get red in the face over it. Scrooge's niece played well upon the harp, and played among other tunes a simple little air, a mere nothing you could learn to whistle in 2 minutes, to which would have been familiar to the child who fetched Scrooge from the boarding school, as he had been reminded of by this ghost of Christmas past. When this strain of music had sounded, all the things that the ghost had shown him came upon his mind. He softened more and more, and thought that if he could have listened to it often years ago, he might have cultivated a kindness of his life, for his own happiness with his own hands, without resorting to the sexton's spade that buried Jacob Marley. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while they played at forfeits, for it's good to be a child sometimes, and never a better time than at Christmas, when its mighty founder was but a child himself. Stop. There was a game of blind man's buff. Of course there was. And I no more believe that Topper was really blind than I believe that he had eyes in his boots. My opinion is that it was a done thing between him and Scrooge's nephew, and that the ghost of Christmas Present knew it well. The way he went after that plump sister and the lace tucker was an outrage on the credulity of human nature. Knocking down the fire irons, tumbling over the chairs, bumping into the piano, smothering themselves among the curtains wherever they were, and wherever she went, there went he. He always knew where the plump sister was. He wouldn't catch anybody else. If you had fallen up against him, and some did, and he would stand there and made a faint endeavor to seize you, with which he would have been a affront to your understanding, and would instantly have sidled off in the direction of the plump sister. She often cried that it wasn't fair, and it really wasn't. But when at last he caught her, when, in spite of all of her silken rustlings and rapid flutterings past him, he got her into the corner whence there was no escape, and his conduct was most execrable. For his pretending not to know her, his pretending that it was necessary to touch her headdress, and further to assure himself of her identity by pressing a certain ring on her finger and a certain chain about her neck. It was vile and monstrous. No doubt she told him her opinion of it when, another blind man being in office, they were so very confident with each other behind the curtains. Scrooge's niece was not one of the blind man's buff party, but she was made comfortable with a large chair and footstool in the snug corner, where the ghost and Scrooge were close behind her. But she joined at forfeits, and loved her love to admiration with all the letters of the alphabet. Likewise, the game of how, when, and where, she was very great, and to the secret joy of Scrooge's nephew, beat her sisters hollow, though they were sharp girls too, as Topper could have told you. They might have been 20 people there, young and old, but they all played, and so did Scrooge, who, wholly forgetting in the interest that he had been in what was going on, that his voice made no sound to their ears. He sometimes came out with his guesses quite loud, and often quite right too. For the sharpest needle, the best Whitechapel, warranted not a cut in the eye, and was not sharper than Scrooge himself, blunt as he took himself to be. The ghost was very greatly pleased to find him in this mood, and looked upon him with such favor that he begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guests departed. But this spirit could not be done. "Here's a new game. 1/2 hour more. Only one, spirit." The game was called Yes or No, and Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest had to find out what it was. He would only answer their questions yes or no, as the case was. The brisk fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, a rather disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes, and talked sometimes too, and lived in London, and walked about the streets, and wasn't made a show of, and wasn't led by anybody, and didn't live in a menagerie, and was never killed in a market, and was not a horse, nor an ass, nor a cow, nor a bull, nor a tiger, nor a dog, nor a pig, nor a cat, nor a bear, At every fresh question that was put to him, Scrooge's nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp. At last the plump sister, falling into a similar state, cried out, "I found it! Fred, I know who it is! I know what it is!" "What is it then?" "It's your Uncle Scrooge!" Which it certainly was. Admiration was the universal sentiment, though some objected that the reply to "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes, inasmuch of an answer of the negative was sufficient to have diverted their thoughts from Mr. Scrooge, supposing that they had ever any tendency in that direction anyway. "He's given us plenty of merriment, I'm sure," said Fred, "and it would be ungrateful of us not to drink his health. Here's a glass of mulled wine ready at our hand for the moment, and I say, Uncle Scrooge." "Well, to Uncle Scrooge!" they all roared. "A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man, whatever he is. He wouldn't take it from me, but he may have it nevertheless. To Uncle Scrooge." Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so gay and light of heart that he would have pledged the unconscious company in return and thanked them with an inaudible speech if the ghost had given him time. But the whole scene passed off beneath the last of the words spoken by his nephew, and he and his spirit were upon the air again in travel. Much they saw, and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. The spirits stood beside sick beds, and they were grateful. On foreign lands, and they were close to home. By struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope. By poverty, and was made rich. In an almshouse, hospital, and jail. In misery's every refuge. Where vain man in his brief authority had not made fast the door and barred the spirit out, he left his blessing and taught Scrooge his precepts. It was a long night, if it were only a night. But Scrooge had his doubts of this, because the Christmas holidays appeared to be condensed into the space that they passed together. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost had grown clearly older. Scrooge had observed this change, but never spoke of it until they had left a children's 12th night party, when, looking at the spirit as they stood together in an open place, he noticed that his hair had gone completely gray. "Are spirits' lives so short?" "My life upon this globe is very brief," replied the ghost. "It ends tonight." "Tonight?" cried Scrooge. "Tonight at midnight. Hark! The time draws near." The chimes were ringing the 3/4 past 11 at that very moment. Forgive me if I'm not justified in what I ask," said Scrooge, looking intently at the spirit's robes. "But I see something strange and not belonging to yourself protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw?" "It might be a claw, but for the flesh there is upon it," was the spirit's sorrowful reply. "Look here." From the foldings of his robe it brought forth 2 children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, and miserable. They knelt down at its feet and clung upon the outside of its garment. "Oh, man, look! Look here! Look!" exclaimed the ghost. They were boy and girl, yellow, meager, ragged, scowling, and wolfish, but prostrate, too, in their humility. Where graceful youth should have filled their features out and touched them with its freshest tint, a stale, shriveled hand like that of age had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out menacingly. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade. Through all the mysteries of wonderful creation has monsters so horrible and dread. Scrooge started back, appalled. Having them shown to him in this way, he tried to say that they were fine children, but the words choked themselves rather than be parties to a lie of such enormous magnitude. "Spirit, are they yours?" "They are man's," said the spirit, looking down at them. "They cling to me and appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware of them both in all their degree, but most of all beware for this boy. For on his brow I see that which is written doom, unless the writing be erased. Deny it, cried the spirit, stretching out his hand toward the city. Slander thee who tell it ye. Admit it for your own facetious purposes, and make it the worst, and bide the end. Have they no refuge, no resource? Are there no prisons? Said the spirit, turning his words on him for the last time. Are there no workhouses? The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost, but saw it not. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting his eyes up, beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground toward him. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me tonight. That was Stave 3 of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. We'll be returning tomorrow night, where we will pick up with the final installment, Stave 4 and 5, The Last of Spirits, and the end of it. Thank you very much for joining in, and I hope you have a lovely evening. Have a good night, everyone.